My house grows a new room every night. Part on Have you ever wondered what your house hides when the lights go out? What if it, grows when you're not looking? What if you woke up one day, and the hallway was longer than it should be? Just a few inches at first? Then, a shadow, where there shouldn't be. And then, a new door. Would you open it? Would you step inside? Or would you pretend you didn't see it at all? Welcome to EchoVerse Whispers, where sleep and nightmares blur into one. Tonight, we begin a journey through a house that should not be alive, but is. A house that grows. A house that waits. A house that remembers you. This is my house, grows a new room every night, 15 nights, 15 doors, and only one way out. Are you ready to find it? My house grows a new room every night, and I didn't notice until the 7th one appeared. A narrow hallway branching off from the pantry that wasn't there before, and at first, I thought I had simply been too tired to notice it earlier, that maybe it had always been there, and my mind had played tricks on me. But something about the smell like old dust, and something older beneath it, told me I hadn't missed anything. That this place had never existed. Until now, and the next night, I found a low, square room, attached to that hallway. Covered in faded wallpaper, that peeled like scabbed skin, and with no doors, no windows. Only a single wooden chair in the center, that faced the corner as if it were being punished. And though I didn't step inside, I stood long enough at its threshold to feel a pulse, soft and slow, like the whole room was breathing. And I backed away, closing the pantry door and pushing a chair against it like a child afraid of monsters. Because in that moment, I wasn't a grown man anymore. I was just fear and bones and a racing heart that told me I shouldn't have looked. And the following morning, the hallway was gone again. The pantry back to its small, broom-filled state. But I felt different, hollowed out. As though something had reached through me in the night and scooped out a piece. And I tried to go about my day, shower, coffee, emails, but everything felt 1 inch to the left of real. Like I was walking through a mirror world where everything had been reconstructed slightly wrong. And that night, despite my best intentions, I found myself drawn to the pantry again. Compelled like a man returning to the scene of a crime he can't remember committing, and sure enough, the hallway had returned. Longer this time, with a flickering bulb that dangled from the ceiling, and cast long, twitching shadows on the floor. And when I walked down it, I found a spiral staircase at the end that led down into a damp, basement-like room I'd never known existed. Filled with old furniture, wrapped in yellowing sheets. And at the center, a wardrobe that whispered my name. Not aloud, but into my head, the way dreams speak without sound. And I turned and ran. The stairs groaning beneath my feet, and when I emerged from the pantry, I slammed the door shut and nailed it closed. Not caring that I had just boarded up part of my own home because something in that wardrobe wanted me to open it. And I couldn't trust myself not to listen, but the house wasn't finished with me yet. And over the next few nights, new anomalies appeared on extra door at the end of the hallway that led to a room filled with ticking clocks, all set to different times, none of them correct. Each one ticking in an offbeat rhythm, like they were trying to sync with something ancient and vast. And then a ladder behind the coat closet that led to a cramped attic that should not have existed in my single-story house. Filled with boxes labeled in my handwriting, but with names and dates I didn't recognize. And each night the house gave me more, as if it were unfolding itself, revealing a blueprint I was never meant to see. and with each new room, I felt the house growing hungrier. Not for food, but for memory, for attention, for something I couldn't name. And I began to forget things, people I had known, routines I'd once followed, the names of distant relatives, all slipping away like water through cupped hands. And the more I explored, the more I lost, until even my own reflection began to look unfamiliar. Like the person in the mirror had taken a different path than me, and was now watching with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And I tried to leave, of course I tried, packed a bag, got in the car, drove 4 miles, but the road kept looping back, every sign twisted, every mile a snake eating its tail, until I realized with a cold, creeping certainty that the house had grown itself outside of itself, extended its reality into the world beyond, and I was still inside it no matter where I went. Because it wasn't just a house anymore, it was a domain, a pocket of space, it controlled absolutely, and I was its guest, its pet, its prisoner. And I began to hear it, at night deep, groaning like wood settling, only it wasn't wood, it was the sound of walls rearranging, corridors extending, doors birthing themselves into existence. And sometimes, when I was very quiet, I could hear footsteps in those rooms. Soft and deliberate, moving in patterns, pacing, circling, like something was learning to walk, and I stopped sleeping in the bedroom, started lying on the floor in the foyer, with all the lights on. Clutching a baseball bat like that would matter if something truly wanted to come through. And on the 14th night, the house offered me a room full of voices, not screaming, not speaking, but whispering in unison, whispering welcome over and over, and the word echoed in my bones like a song I once knew. And for a moment, I felt a deep, terrifying peace, as if I belonged, as if I was home. And then the lights blew out, and the whispering stopped, and the door slammed shut behind me, and I was in complete darkness, with the sound of breathing all around. Not mine, never mine, and the house sighed, satisfied, as if it had grown another part of itself. And I understood with a clarity that shattered me. I was no longer the owner of this house, was its newest room. My house grows a new room every night. Part 2, my house grows a new room every night, and on the 15th night, after I clawed my way back from the dark whispering room, the house greeted me with silence, so thick, it pressed against my ears like water. Every creak and groan of its shifting walls suddenly paused as if it were watching me now, studying me, learning my rhythms the way I had tried to learn its split. But now I knew that was a futile effort, because this house was not a puzzle to be solved, but a living, breathing entity that grew inwards and backwards and sidewards through time, birthing space in folds and recesses that defied logic. And as I staggered through the familiar hallway back toward what I used to call my living room, I noticed that every photograph on the wall had changed, subtly at first, like the eyes of my mother were facing slightly left instead of straight ahead, or that the dog I'd owned as a child now wore a collar with a tag that read "belongs to the house." And I stood there, heart pounding, staring at that tag until my vision blurred, because it meant that nothing was sacred, nothing untouchable, and that even memory could be rewritten room by room. And I didn't sleep that night or the next. I just sat by the front door, which now had no knob, watching the walls breathe, and listening to the ceiling hum a lullaby that made me nauseous. And on the 17th night, a new hallway opened behind the bathroom mirror, the glass melting like water when I touched it. rippling to reveal a narrow corridor lined with floor-length portraits of people I didn't recognize, but who all looked slightly like me. Distorted as though pulled from a bloodline I hadn't explored yet, their faces elongated, their smiles wrong. Too many teeth, and not enough kindness, and they blinked in sync when I passed by. And though I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, I knew better. I knew they were watching, waiting, judging my presence the way cells might judge a virus. And at the end of that corridor was a staircase going down, not the familiar spiral from before but a steep, infinite drop of rusted metal steps, disappearing into blue darkness, and I turned away, refusing to descend. But the mirror didn't let me back through. And I stood trapped in that portrait hallway for what must have been hours before the floor beneath me folded like fabric and dropped me into another room entirely, one I hadn't seen before, a room full of clocks shaped like human hearts, each ticking in wet, organic beats, and when I stepped closer, I saw that each clock bore a name, mine, others close to mine, and one in particular that stopped me cold. James Heron. 6:13 a.m., because that was my father's name and the exact time. He'd died 15 years ago of a sudden aneurysm in the kitchen while making tea. And I stumbled back, horrified, my hand brushing against another clock that pulsed against my fingers, warm and wet. And the room blinked around me, not with light, but with presence, like I was being absorbed. And when I finally found a door and tore it open, I emerged into a living room filled with mannequins dressed in the clothes I'd worn over the last month, all standing perfectly still, facing away from me, and one turned its head not physically, but I felt it turn inside my mind, and I screamed, running past them to find the kitchen, only to discover it was no longer a kitchen, but a vast field of red grass, stretching in all directions, beneath a sky of fractured glass. And in the distance, my house floated, slowly rotating, as though I'd been expelled into a memory of what it wanted me to believe the world was, and I walked for what felt like days, the red grass whispering in languages I almost understood. And eventually, I reached the floating house again, but the front door was 20 feet above the ground and guarded by a creature stitched from the walls and doorframes of rooms I thought I'd forgotten. And it spoke in the voice of my childhood friend Daniel, who died in a lake when we were 11, saying, "You came back too soon." And then it opened a hatch in its chest and revealed a staircase leading inside. And I stepped into it because there was no other choice, and I emerged into my bedroom, perfectly restored. Sunlight streaming through the window, birdsong outside, my phone blinking with texts from coworkers, and for a moment I thought I'd dreamed it all. That maybe my mind had cracked, but then I saw the calendar on the wall, and it said October 3rd, 1977, and I wasn't even born yet. And in the mirror above my dresser, was my father, younger, smiling a smile that trembled, as though it didn't belong to him, and I stumbled out into the hallway, where framed photos now showed a family I didn't recognize, a wife, 2 kids, a dog, all of whom looked at me with the kind of forced cheer you see in funeral photos. And down the hall, the nursery door was cracked open, and I heard a music box playing a tune I've never known but that instantly made my teeth ache and my nose bleed. And when I stepped into the room, the crib was empty save for a note that said, "Thank you for returning," and suddenly, the walls rippled, and the floor dropped again. And I fell for what must have been hours, landing in a theater with velvet seats and a silver screen, on which played footage of my life, but wrong, distorted scenes, played backwards, or looped endlessly. Like my high school graduation, followed by my funeral, followed by my birth, again and again, and I sat, transfixed, as the house narrated my failures in the voice of my dead grandmother, soft and mocking, and I realized then, the house wasn't showing me rooms, it was showing me versions, possibilities, branching timelines like veins in a leaf. Each room, a life I could have lived or did live, or will live if I make the wrong turn again. And the more I saw, the more I forgot what my original life even was. Until the only truth I had left was this: the house is eternal. The house is patient, and every night it grows, not just a room but a memory, a path, a trap, and the more I walk its halls, the more it becomes me, and I become it. And when I woke up back on my floor in the foyer, the lights flickering, nails clawed and bloody from gripping the floorboards in my sleep, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just rose and waited, because I knew that tonight, the house would grow again, and I would follow, and I would forget, and soon, very soon, there would be nothing left of me that didn't belong to it. My house grows a new room every night. Part 3. My house grows a new room every night. And by the 18th night, I stopped pretending I had any power over the walls I once called home, because when the sun went down that evening, the windows did not dim but instead glowed with a sickly green light, as if the sky outside had been replaced with something radioactive and infinite. And when I touched the glass, it pulsed under my fingers like a slow heartbeat echoing far below the surface of an ocean I couldn't see. And I realized that what I thought was outside was no longer there at all. That the street, the neighborhood, the world I once believed in, had been overwritten by the house's expanding design. And that whatever remained of the old reality was either buried beneath layers of its architecture, or had been devoured altogether. And when I turned away from the window, the living room had rearranged itself, the couch fused to the ceiling, like it had grown there, the TV replaced with a black square that showed only static in the shape of an eye that blinked when I looked away. And in the corner sat a child-sized figure with its back to me, head bowed, hands limp in its lap, and I knew better than to speak. But something in me, a thread of curiosity or self-destruction, whispered to approach. And as I neared, I saw that it was wearing my childhood clothes. The same orange dinosaur pajamas I had loved and lost when I was 5, and when I leaned closer, it raised its head slightly, not enough to show its face but just enough for the air to change, to thicken, to tremble with a low-frequency hum that made my teeth buzz and my throat dry out like old paper. And it whispered one word, soon in. A voice that sounded like mine but not from this life, and I stumbled back, tripping over a floorboard that hadn't been there seconds ago. And when I looked again, the figure was gone, replaced with a chair that was slowly spinning by itself, casting long, twisted shadows that didn't match its shape. And I ran to the stairs, but the stairs no longer led up, they now spiraled sideways into a hallway that was too narrow for any adult to pass comfortably through, and the walls were lined with pictures of doorways, endless doorways, all slightly different, some cracked open, some closed, some gaping wide. And at the end of that hallway was a single switch labeled reset in red paint that dripped upward instead of down. And I didn't touch it, couldn't, because something in my bones screamed that pressing it would not return things to how they were but instead return me to some earlier, broken version of myself. So I turned and crawled backward through the claustrophobic tunnel. The pictures whispering names behind me, Names I almost recognized: Amber, Felix, Marlowe. E-names that felt like old passwords to lives I had once lived but could no longer access. And when I finally emerged, I was in the kitchen again, but it was underwater now, not metaphorically but literally, as if some invisible membrane held thousands of gallons of black water perfectly still in the room. Suspended above me, inside of which swam shapes that looked like people but moved too fluidly, too silently, their eyes open and staring with expressions of perfect, frozen agony as they floated past, and I stepped around the perimeter, not daring to cross under that aquatic ceiling, afraid it would break, or worse, choose to descend, and as I passed the refrigerator, it opened by itself to reveal a staircase descending into frost and fog, and, though I knew the pattern, knew that descending meant forgetting, meant becoming less human, I stepped in, each stair crackling beneath my feet, cold seeping into my skin, my bones, my thoughts, and by the time I reached the bottom, I couldn't remember my name, or why I was afraid. Only that the walls here were soft and breathing, like lungs, and that they whispered stories about stars that had died before humanity ever learned to count time, and in the center of that chamber was a table. And on the table, a journal with my handwriting in it. Only the language wasn't English, it wasn't any language I'd ever learned, but I could read it anyway, fluently, because it spoke directly into the mind's eye, bypassing logic, cutting through the meat of the brain into the deeper places, where dreams go to die. And the entries said things like Night 34. He has begun to respond to auditory stimuli. And Night 57. The corridor now resets faster. Subject retention is holding. And Night 82. Consciousness fragmentation is optimal. And with dawning horror I realized the journal was written by the house itself, documenting me, my descent, my transformation, and it had been doing this for longer than I'd been aware. Much longer. Maybe years. Maybe forever. And as I slammed the journal shut, the fog thickened and something began to move in the distance. A shape with too many joints and a mouth where its stomach should be. Crawling on the ceiling like a spider, its eyes blinking sideways, and I turned and ran. The stairwell gone now, replaced by a ladder of bone that led up through a chute lined with whispering mouths. And I climbed without hesitation. Because I had learned by now that hesitation got you seen, and when I pulled myself out, I was in my bathroom again, but the mirror showed a version of me still trapped in that underwater kitchen, still looking up at the black ocean above, unaware that I had moved on, that I had splintered. And I touched the glass and felt cold, and pressure, and grief, all at once, like mourning a version of yourself you can no longer reach. And the door behind me opened, and my voice said, "Don't turn around." So I didn't, I just walked into the hall and closed the door and pretended the sound of something dragging its hands along the walls behind me wasn't real. And I found my bedroom, lights off, but the moon outside now blinked like an eye. And it opened and closed every few seconds, casting shadows in strange shapes across the bed, and on the pillow was a note written in blood that said, "Room des Navi is almost ready," and I lay down, too exhausted to fight anymore, and the bed swallowed me like quicksand, pulling me through layers of sleep and memory and falsified timelines. And I dreamed of a world where the house was a museum and I was the only exhibit. My thoughts archived behind glass, my emotions filed away in drawers that opened and shut on their own, and when I awoke, I had the distinct feeling that someone had watched me dream, taken notes, made edits, because I could no longer remember the color of my mother's eyes, or whether I'd ever been in love, or what my favorite song used to be, and I understood that every new room was not just a space, it was a subtraction, a toll, a price, and if this continued, by the time I reached the 15th room, there would be nothing left of me but an echo in the walls, whispering soon to the next version of me who would forget everything all over again. My house grows a new room every night, Part 4. My house grows a new room every night, and on the 20th night it grew one that breathed, not metaphorically or symbolically but with real, warm air that pushed in and out like lungs beneath floorboards, and when I stepped into it, the walls expanded with my inhale and contracted with my exhale, syncing perfectly, as if the room had been tailored to my specific biology, my rhythm, my breath, and standing there felt like being inside a living thing's ribcage, with the low groan of tendons pulling against invisible joints echoing in every corner. And I tried to leave immediately, but the door behind me was gone, melted into a smooth wall that pulsed once like a heartbeat before stilling. And the light in the room wasn't light at all, but an ambient glow that came from the pores in the floor, tiny openings that opened and shut like eyelids, and each time they blinked, a soft voice whispered something in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood, not through meaning but through sensation, and the feeling was always the same: you are not whole, but you are enough for now. And I sat down in the center, not out of surrender but exhaustion, because I hadn't truly slept in days, not really. And the floor softened beneath me, rising slightly to cradle my weight like a living cushion. And I must have drifted, not into sleep, but into something deeper, because when I came to, I wasn't alone, and across from me was another version of myself. Identical in every detail except the eyes. Mine were bloodshot and dull, his were pitch black and still. And he didn't blink or breathe. Just stared at me like I was the dream, like I was the thing that didn't belong, and then he raised a hand and pointed toward the wall, which peeled back in slow, wet layers to reveal a corridor I hadn't seen before, filled with floating orbs of memory, literal suspended moments that hovered like soap bubbles, each one glowing faintly and containing a scene from my past. But when I approached the first, something was wrong. Because the memory inside was not how I remembered it, not even close. It was my 7th birthday party, but all the faces were blank, featureless, and the cake read happy replication instead of my name. And my mother's voice sang in reverse, a high-pitched dirge that made my ears throb, and I reached out to touch the orb. But it burst before my fingers reached it, releasing a sharp, metallic screech that echoed down the corridor. And in the distance, I heard something stir, something huge and mechanical and alive, and I turned to run, but the floor flipped like a hinge and I fell through it, screaming, into a pitch-black shaft that smelled like burnt hair and rust. And I landed in a room that shouldn't have existed. A childhood bedroom I never had, filled with toys I didn't remember but knew how to use. And on the bed sat a child wearing my face, drawing on the walls with a crayon made of bone, and when I asked him who he was, he said, "I'm what you lost to get here," and kept drawing until his fingers bled. And every line he made twisted the room, more walls folding inward, the window turning into a mouth that whispered questions I didn't have answers to. And then I blinked and he was gone, replaced by rows of filing cabinets that stretched into the dark, each one labeled with a date and a sensation. July 3, 2011. Regret, December 18, 2006. J.O. White. March 29, 2020. Shame and I opened one out of instinct, and inside was not a file, but a perfectly preserved moment in a jar. My own face reflected in the glass, weeping. Repeating the words, "Don't forget the hands," over and over, and I dropped it, but it didn't break. It just screamed as it hit the floor and rolled away into the dark, and then all the drawers opened at once, unleashing a flood of noise. Every voice I'd ever known, yelling things I'd never heard. And I collapsed to my knees, covering my ears, screaming to drown them out. And when the sound finally stopped, I was back in my living room, only it was upside down. The furniture nailed to the ceiling, and the walls dripping black ichor from vents that now blinked like eyes. And in the center of the room, stood a grandfather clock I didn't own. Its pendulum, a swinging severed arm, pointing with each motion, toward a door that hadn't been there yesterday. Labeled guest room in crooked, childlike handwriting, and I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know who the guest was. But the door opened on its own, and inside was a version of my apartment, exactly as it had been 10 years ago. When everything still made sense, and sitting on the couch was my ex-girlfriend, reading a book that had no title. And when she looked up at me, her eyes were gone. Just skin stretched where they should have been, and she smiled and said, "We never broke up in this version," and reached out to me, her fingers elongating as they moved, wrapping around my wrist before I could pull away. And the room around us shimmered like heat haze and melted into a cathedral made of teeth. Rows of pews lined with people who looked like everyone I'd ever passed on the street, but never spoken to, and they all turned to face me as the bells rang, not with chimes but with sobs. And I was marched to the altar by faceless ushers who whispered prayers in binary code. And at the altar stood myself again, wearing a priest's collar and holding a mirror that reflected not my face but the house itself, vast and endless, stretching into darkness forever. And the me on the altar said, "You may now enter the next room." And the floor opened beneath me again, and I fell into a silence so deep it roared. And when I landed, the house whispered, "5 down, 10 to go," and I curled into myself, terrified of what room 6 would bring, but too broken to do anything but wait. My house grows a new room every night, part 6. My house grows a new room every night, and on the 22nd night it grew one that whispered before it even opened. A door I had never seen but heard long before it revealed itself, tucked behind the linen closet where the wall had once been. Solid, now peeling like old skin to show a narrow passageway of velvet and static, lined with paper-thin whispers that fluttered like moths with every breath I took. And the air was thick with the scent of cedar and decay, like an attic sealed for centuries but still dreaming. And as I stepped through, the passage closed behind me with a sigh, trapping me in a darkness that pressed close to my skin, intimate and knowing, and I had the awful sense that something was crawling just behind my thoughts. A tickling that wasn't physical but real nonetheless, and then faint light bloomed around me, sourced not from a bulb but from the ground itself, the floor composed of words etched in glowing red ink, sentences from books I never wrote, diaries I never kept, all narrating my actions in real time with chilling precision. He walks, hesitant, trying to remember what his name was before the house took it, and the more I moved, the more the floor revealed, like the house was writing my story as I walked, or perhaps rewriting it, overwriting the one I thought was mine. And at the end of the corridor, a set of double doors carved from ivory bones stood ajar. And inside was a theater filled with empty chairs, that all faced a stage, bathed in golden light, where a marionette version of me stood lifeless on strings, its wooden head lolling forward until I stepped closer and it jerked upright. Suddenly animated, its mouth opening to speak in my voice but not my words, declaring in rhythmic cadence that the rooms are chapters and you are the ink. And with every syllable it uttered, I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was pulling parts of me out, words I'd once said, feelings I hadn't yet experienced. And it danced, clumsily, violently, until the strings snapped, and it collapsed on the stage, twitching like a dying animal. And the audience, still empty, clapped anyway. A slow, thunderous applause from nowhere that shook dust from the ceiling. And the back wall of the theater crumbled away to reveal a desert beneath a lavender sky. Stars moving like insects across the horizon, and I stepped through instinctively. Boots crunching over pale sand that screamed with each step. And out in that desert stood a house, a duplicate of my own, but upside down. Foundation in the sky, roof buried in the earth, and its windows blinked at me like watchful eyes, and I approached slowly, knowing what I would find before I entered. Inside, everything was reversed, rooms I knew twisted backward. Furniture nailed to the ceiling, clocks ticking counterclockwise, and the hallway lights glowing dimly in an unnatural shade of red that buzzed with something insectile. And I climbed what should have been stairs but moved like escalator treads beneath my feet, pulling me deeper into the home I no longer recognized. And in the kitchen, a feast was laid out, steaming, fresh. But the food was sculpted from wax and teeth. Meals I had dreamed of but never eaten. Dishes cooked with ingredients I couldn't name. And around the table sat versions of me, one in a hospital gown, one in a wedding tuxedo I had never worn, one older and missing an eye, and they all turned to stare as I entered. Not in surprise but in recognition, as if I was the final guest, and the one in the tuxedo stood and said, "We've been waiting for you to carve," and pointed to a block of flesh on the table shaped like a heart but covered in eyes, each blinking in slow sequence, and I was handed a knife that melted the moment I touched it, and the walls groaned with disappointment. And a new door opened beside the stove, this one breathing like a lung, its surface shuddering with anticipation. And I stepped into it because I had learned that refusal meant punishment, and found myself in a tunnel filled with filing cabinets labeled not with dates but with feelings never felt. And I opened one, and inside was a jar that contained the joy of being understood, glowing softly, warm to the touch. And when I held it to my chest, I sobbed without understanding why, and the tunnel responded by shifting shape, collapsing behind me and expanding ahead, forcing me forward, deeper, until I reached a chamber where the ceiling was a mirror and the floor a shallow pool of blood. And the only way through was to crawl, and as I did, the blood whispered names of people I had forgotten. People I may have loved or betrayed or buried. And the mirror showed them watching me crawl, shaking their heads, weeping, laughing, some of them applauding as if my suffering confirmed something they had long suspected. And when I emerged, soaked and shaking, I found myself back in my living room, but the TV was on, and it played a news report announcing my disappearance, dated 2 years in the future. And in the reflection of the screen, I could see a shadow behind me that wasn't mine, taller, thicker, pulsing with slow breaths. And when I turned, no one was there, just the closet door slowly creaking open on its own. And inside was a staircase made entirely of teeth, each step clicking as I climbed. And at the top was a child's room, from a dream I had when I was 6. Perfectly replicated, including the crayon drawings I had long since forgotten. One of which showed the house with long legs and a mouth on its roof. And beneath it I had written in shaky print, "The house wants to be my dad," and sitting on it. The bed was a stuffed animal I had buried in the woods when I was 9. Smiling, arms open, and as I picked it up, it whispered, "You're almost ready." And the walls of the room peeled back, like theater curtains, revealing a cathedral of memories suspended in glass, floating, spinning, and in each memory I could see versions of myself smiling, broken, scared, violent, joyous, hollow, and the house, always in the background, watching, adjusting, preparing me. And as the lights dimmed, a chime rang out that I hadn't heard before, deep and final, like a countdown had ended. And etched into the glass beneath my feet was a single word, glowing brighter and brighter with every breath I took. 7, and the room blinked out, like a closed eye, leaving only the sound of slow applause and a whisper that said, "Next one changes everything." My house grows a new room every night, Part 8. My house grows a new room every night, and on the 23rd night it grew one that bled through the walls before I ever saw it. A thick syrupy fluid that dripped from the corners of the ceiling in trails shaped like veins, moving of their own. A cord, crawling down like they knew where they were going, staining the hardwood floors with symbols I couldn't decipher but instinctively feared. And when I tried to step over them, the house shifted beneath me, tilting just enough to guide me toward the new door that had bloomed like a wound behind the bathroom mirror, now shattered into glittering slivers across the sink. Each shard reflecting not my face, but the hallway behind me. Only the hallway didn't exist in this world yet. It was a preview, a glimpse of what I was about to walk into. And when I passed through the mirror frame and into the new room, I realized instantly that I had stepped into a version of the house that had died long ago. Everything rotted and waterlogged, mold forming fractal constellations across every surface. And the air was alive with tiny black insects that swarmed but never touched me, forming brief sentences in the air before dissolving, like "Don't answer the floor," and "Time only moves when you bleed." And the floor was carpeted in photographs, thousands of them, curling at the corners, all of them depicting the same room from slightly different angles, as if they were captured frame by frame from surveillance footage taken over centuries. And in each photo there was a figure, a man, sometimes faceless, sometimes wearing my expression, standing in different positions, never quite still, as if trying to move through time, one photograph at a time. And when I picked one up, I felt my nose begin to bleed, and the blood dripped onto the image and was immediately absorbed. The figure within, twisting violently until he faced me and mouthed something I couldn't hear but felt in my stomach. "You're behind schedule," and the room groaned in response, shaking dust from the ceiling which formed into falling feathers made of teeth, and I ran. Instinct pushing me through a rusted metal door that hadn't been there a moment ago. And on the other side I was underwater, but breathing, lungs filled with something thick and warm. And I was in a hallway submerged in liquid that shimmered like oil. Walls lined with portholes showing versions of me trapped in submerged versions of other rooms, all of them clawing at the glass, begging, their mouths full of darkness, and the hallway bent sharply into a spiral, drawing me downward until the pressure in my ears nearly burst them. And at the center was a room lit by hundreds of dangling light bulbs, each suspended by a single red string connected to the ceiling. But the bulbs were filled with moving insects and tiny human teeth instead of filament, and the walls were made entirely of hair, blonde, black, gray, all moving subtly, breathing in sync with my own heartbeat. On the far wall was painted in blood the phrase, "You left her behind." And I screamed without meaning to, because I knew instantly who her was but couldn't remember her name. Only her absence, only the weight of a forgotten promise. And the house responded by opening a trap door beneath me, and I fell for what felt like hours, passing windows in the walls of the shaft that showed moments I thought I had survived. First funeral, my first lie. The first time I heard the house whisper my name, and, when I landed, it was in a room made entirely of clocks, all ticking at different speeds, all broken in different ways. Some bleeding, some coughing smoke, and in the center stood a girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing a paper crown and a dress made of static, and she turned slowly and said, "You were supposed to find me sooner." And with that, every clock stopped ticking at once, plunging the room into a silence so complete, I heard my own thoughts echo back at me with strange distortion. And the girl reached into her chest and pulled out a key, shaped like a screaming mouth, handed it to me, then stepped backward and disappeared through the wall as if she were never real, and I used the key on the only door I could see, which was painted on the wall like a cartoon but peeled open under my touch like old wallpaper, revealing a library where the books breathed, rising and falling as if asleep, and each book was bound in skin. Some soft like a newborn's, others rough like tree bark, and the shelves curved upward into infinity, vanishing into darkness. And a spiral staircase made of hands reached up the center, each hand open and trembling, supporting the next like an offering, and I climbed it, counting each step even though I knew numbers meant nothing here. Until I reached a platform where a man with a typewriter for a head sat hunched over a desk, typing endlessly, feeding paper into himself. And on those pages I saw my thoughts printed in real time, even the ones I didn't want to admit. And he handed me a page without looking, and it read, "The room is not new, it is only returning." And then he burst into flame, wordlessly, his ashes forming a path to the next door, this one circular and spinning like a coin. And I stepped through and found myself in a graveyard, where every tombstone bore my name, but with different birth and death dates, some impossibly ancient, others labeled tomorrow. And the grass was black and soft, and beneath it I could hear scratching, like something trying to get out. And the sky blinked and whispered, "This is what you become when you ignore the warnings." And I ran again, through a mausoleum door into a room made of melted wax and doll faces, all smiling, all weeping, and hanging from the ceiling was a mobile of my memories, each one encased in glass spheres filled with teeth, and the mobile spun faster as I entered, whispering faster and faster, until I could barely breathe, and then it stopped. And one sphere shattered, revealing an image of me screaming at someone I didn't remember but loved deeply. And the sound of that memory being erased filled the room like a siren, and the dolls began to scream, and the wax floor cracked open, revealing a staircase downward that pulsed like a throat. And I descended because there was no other way, and at the bottom was a room labeled EIGHT. Simple, sterile, white, with one chair in the middle and a screen on the wall, and on that screen played a video of me entering each of the previous rooms, compiled like surveillance footage, and as I watched, I realized I moved differently in the recordings, confident, purposeful, smiling, and the realization hit me like a wave. I wasn't watching the past. I was watching the other me, the version that had obeyed perfectly. The version the house liked more, and the screen turned to static, then to the words "he will get there first," and the door locked behind me with a sound like a closing mouth, and the lights dimmed, and in that dark, I heard breathing, not my own. Something wet and eager just out of sight, and I knew the next room would not wait for me to be ready. My house grows a new room every night part. My house grows a new room every night, and on the 24th night, it grew one that hummed with something mechanical and alive, like the low growl of some sleeping machine nestled deep in the bones of the house. And when I woke, the sound wasn't coming from any one direction but from all around me, vibrating the walls, my bed frame, the fillings in my teeth. And when I stood up, the floor was softer than it should have been, almost like skin pulled tight over bone, and the walls pulsed with a subtle rhythm that matched my heartbeat for 3 beats before overtaking it. And then I saw it another new door where my bookshelf had been the night before. This one steel, and embedded with blinking lights, in patterns that shifted the more I tried to memorize them. And when I touched the handle it felt cold and wet at the same time. And as it opened, I smelled ozone and antiseptic, like a hospital. At the edge of a lightning storm, and the room beyond was unlike any other the house had ever offered me. Metallic walls, flickering halogen panels on the ceiling, a smooth silver floor etched with branching paths of circuitry glowing faintly blue. And in the center was a capsule, cylindrical and filled with thick translucent liquid. And floating inside was me, or someone exactly like me, hooked to a web of wires snaking from the ceiling like veins, mouth open in silent scream, eyes flickering beneath the lids like he was dreaming something monstrous. And around the capsule were monitors displaying, not video, but word strings of commands, diagnostic codes, memories rendered as data fragments, and when I looked closer, I saw moments I had lived. The time I broke my arm in 3rd grade, the night I saw my dog vanish into the hallway and never return. Even the exact words I whispered to the dark the first time I heard the house call my name. And suddenly one of the screens blinked red and said, "Primary consciousness. Out of sync reboot required," and the capsule hissed as the fluid drained and the body inside spasmed, eyes opening wide to reveal empty sockets filled with static. And I backed away, but the capsule burst open and the thing inside collapsed to the floor, coughing thick black smoke, and then it rose slowly, face twitching into a smile not meant for human skin. And it whispered, "There's not enough space for both of us," before lunging, but instead of hitting me, it passed through me like mist. And I dropped to my knees, screaming as a torrent of memories, not mine, flooded my mind. Memories of rooms I had never entered, lives I had never lived, deaths I had never died, and I stood again in a different space. Now in what looked like a surgical theater, but the operating table was covered in versions of me, layered on top of each other like geological strata. Each one older, sadder, more broken, and above them floated mechanical arms that stitched, carved, peeled, reassembled, endlessly building some ideal version of myself out of all the failures. And the lights dimmed, and from the shadows emerged a figure cloaked in circuitry, face masked by shifting screens displaying different emotions like emojis, but distorted rage that bled, joy that cracked, sorrow that screamed, and it spoke in a voice layered with hundreds of mine, all saying different things at once, and I could only understand one phrase clearly: "You are the blueprint, but not the final product." And suddenly I was back in the hallway again. But this time it was endless and looped in impossible ways. Every door I passed was another version of my front door. But each led to a twisted, alternate memory, one where I had never entered the house, one where I burned it down, one where I lived in it peacefully until I aged into dust, and I finally chose a door at random and found myself in a room made entirely of flesh, pulsing with breath, heartbeats echoing from every corner, and in the center was a beating organ suspended by chains, etched with my name and surrounded by mirrors that didn't reflect me but someone else entirely. Someone who looked like me but smiled too widely, blinked too slowly, and mouthed the word soon over and over. And as I turned to leave, the heart stopped beating and the room began to collapse in on itself, folding like origami, squeezing until I was pressed flat against the mirror. And just before I was crushed, I fell backward into blackness and landed on a bridge made of bones, stretching over a chasm of whispering mouths. And the sky above was filled with stars forming constellations, shaped like rooms, each one labeled with emotions: shame, regret, ecstasy. Dread. And the bridge led to a doorway marked with the number 9 glowing faintly blue, and inside was a control room filled with levers, screens, and switches, all labeled with aspects of myself: empathy, impulse, sleep, truth, denial, and a giant red button labeled restart. And as I stood there, a countdown began on the screens, slowly ticking down from 66 to 606, and every second that passed made me feel heavier, like gravity was intensifying. And the moment I reached for a lever labeled pain tolerance, a voice crackled through an unseen speaker and said, "Touch anything and you become one of the rooms." And that's when I noticed it. Each wall had faces frozen in agony, mouths open in silent screams, eyes rolling, all stretched and half melted into the metal. And they were people I almost remembered, almost recognized. And then the screen flashed with a phrase: "This is not a house. This is a machine for building prisons from memory." And every lever suddenly began to move on its own, the room rumbling violently, alarms blaring, and a hidden hatch opened in the floor, revealing a tunnel downward made of smooth glass, showing scenes from my life on the outside, some real, some warped, some that hadn't happened yet. I slid into it because the room began to fill with black fluid from the ceiling, and as I slid, my own reflection kept pace beside me in the glass. But it never blinked, never breathed. And at the end I fell into a massive chamber filled with ticking clocks, whispering books, and a colossal beating heart suspended above a black throne made of doors. And seated on it was me, not me, something more, dressed in a patchwork of my own discarded identities. And he raised one hand and said, "Room 9 is your last chance to remember." And I felt every door I'd entered open in my mind all at once, their sounds deafening, and then silence, and the throne room vanished, leaving only the words, "What you build builds you," burning into the dark behind my eyes as the next door creaked open in the corner of my room. My house grows a new room every night. Part 10. My house grows a new room every night, and on the 25th night it grew one I almost didn't notice. A door that hadn't been there when I went to bed but was somehow already open when I woke up, as if it had grown bored of waiting for me and decided to invite itself into my waking world. And the air that drifted from its frame was heavy with a smell that defied description, part soil, part ozone, part the scent of something ancient waking up. And I should have run, or at least closed the door and sealed it behind brick and prayer, but instead I was pulled toward it by something deeper than curiosity. a gravitational need to understand the thing that had made my house its cocoon. And when I stepped through the threshold, I found myself standing in an impossibly vast greenhouse, illuminated by a violet sun suspended in a sky painted on the ceiling, and every plant that grew there pulsed with slow movement, as if breathing or thinking, their leaves glistening with iridescent fluids. And at first it was beautiful in that alien way beauty sometimes becomes monstrous. But as I walked further into the room, I realized the plants were growing in patterns, rose grids, spirals, and, at the center of each spiral, was a cradle made of bone. Each one holding something that looked vaguely human but wasn't, not exactly. Like something halfway through, molting into what it would become. And one of them opened its eyes and stared directly at me, and its gaze filled my head with static. And behind the static I heard my own voice repeating, "Don't pick the fruit." Though I wasn't sure why until I noticed the vines creeping toward me from behind, barbed and glistening with anticipation, so I turned and ran, blindly, through the vegetation until I burst through a cluster of black trees and into a clearing where a mirror stood alone, not reflecting my body but instead showing the hallway of my house, only it was upside down and crawling with spiders made of keys, each one dragging tiny doors behind it. And the longer I looked, the more I realized the spiders weren't crawling toward me but away from something deeper in the mirror. Something pulsing in the background like a heartbeat made of footsteps. And suddenly I was yanked backward by an unseen force, and found myself in a room of impossible geometry, where the floor folded into the ceiling and the walls spiraled like intestines, and the air there was thick with whispers, each one offering me a different version of the truth. You died in room 6. You never existed before room 1, this house isn't growing, it's remembering. And as I stumbled forward, I found a staircase of glass bones leading to a floating platform where a table sat, covered in photographs of every room I'd entered so far, each image labeled with words like regret, replication, sacrifice, and error, and standing behind the table was a woman with no mouth, her skin stitched with moving symbols that rearranged themselves every time I blinked. And she held out her hand to me, offering a bell made of teeth, and when I touched it, it rang without sound and I was pulled instantly into another space, where time dripped like liquid down the walls and gravity pulsed with a made the floor lurch. Sorrow made the air dense. Fear accelerated. The first, it sucked me into a memory I had no part, in a cold room where a woman with empty eye sockets gave birth to a door, not a baby, but a solid wooden door covered in wet placenta and nails, and she smiled as something pulled it from her with a wet snap and whispered, "All rooms are born screaming." And I fell backward into the next door, which dropped me into a realm that looked like my childhood home, but inverted. Colors warped, and ceiling crawling with hands that pointed at me accusingly. Each finger inscribed with my name over and over until the word lost meaning, and I ran again. But this time it wasn't through rooms or hallways but through time itself, skipping over memories like stones, landing briefly in each moment long enough to feel its weight before being hurled forward. And somewhere in the blur I saw myself standing before the house long before I ever moved in. A child staring up at its windows like they were eyes, and beside me stood a shadow that whispered, "We picked you before you were born." And I screamed at it to tell me why, but it only reached into my chest and pulled out a small brass key that glowed with a sick, yellow warmth. And I was back in the chamber now, surrounded by piles of identical keys, each vibrating slightly, And one by one, they rose and flew into new keyholes appearing on the walls. And with each turn, a new room opened, and each one was wrong in a way that infected the senses. One was a dentist's office, where the chairs were covered in living skin, and the tools moved on their own. One was a daycare, where every child had my face, and each of them screamed at the same pitch whenever I blinked. One was a prison cell filled with nothing but recordings of my voice, narrating futures that hadn't happened. And then I found the door labeled 11, carved into a frame made entirely of fingernails, and when I entered, the sound vanished completely, and the room was filled with floating masks and paper. Some porcelain, some made of stretched skin, and each one turned to follow me, with empty sockets. And one dropped into my hands, and fused to my skin, and suddenly I wasn't me anymore. I was the version of myself that stayed in the house forever. The one who stopped fighting, stopped asking questions, and built the rooms myself. Brick by brick, nail by nail, because someone had to carry on the structure. And I began to remember things I had never lived. How the house first spoke, how it opened its walls to me, how I fed it names, and in return it gave me doors, and I collapsed to my knees as I saw a version of myself, staring back through the eyes of the house. A puppeteer and puppet all at once. And then the silence shattered into a scream, as the walls split open, and thousands of hands reached out, dragging me into a chamber where time didn't exist. Just the thrum of blood and memory, and the voice of the house saying, "You're almost ready." And I begged it to stop. But I knew I didn't want it to, not really. Because the further I went, the more whole I felt. And that's when I saw the diagrams etched into the ceiling, blueprints for every room I had visited, each marked as success or failure, and next to them, blueprints for versions of me, each more fragmented than the last, until the final one was just a silhouette labeled host. And the lights dimmed as the next door revealed itself, but this one wasn't numbered, just marked with a sigil I had seen burned into my dreams. And as I stepped forward, the hallway behind me collapsed into nothing, sealing me in with the choice: forward, or never again. And so I took the final step, and let the room close behind me, like a mouth locking its jaw. My house grows a new room every night. Part 12. My house grows a new room every night. And on the 27th night, it gave me a room that was not a room at all, but a vast amphitheater carved into the body of something breathing, its walls pulsating softly as if with the rhythm of an unseen heart, the stone beneath my feet slick with condensation and veins glowing just below the surface in faint red and green patterns that moved when I stepped closer. And there were no lights, only an ambient luminescence that seemed to come from the air itself, thick with spores that shimmered like dust suspended in amber. And the seats of the amphitheater were occupied by empty suits of clothing, no people. No forms inside them, just coats, dresses, uniforms, robes, each one sitting in perfect stillness, all facing the center where a stage rose from the floor with a motion like exhalation. And on that stage stood a version of me, tall and too thin, its limbs bent slightly wrong, its eyes like cloudy mirrors that reflected things I hadn't done yet. And it opened its mouth but spoke only in whispers that I could feel but not hear. Vibrations in my bones that reshaped my spine with each syllable, and I felt myself pulled forward, no longer walking but gliding toward the stage, where the other me reached out a hand. And when I took it, we fell not downward, but inward, through a tunnel of static, where fragments of memories I'd never lived flashed around me, standing at an altar made of clocks, whispering secrets to a god that looked like my father but made of bees, walking backward into a sea made of hair. And when we landed, it was inside another version of my house, one that was much older, decrepit. Its floors soft with rot, and its windows covered in flesh that pulsed like lungs. And the other me said without moving lips, "This is the root." And I understood without knowing how, that this place was the origin of the growing, the seed, from which every room had bloomed outward, and as we moved through its halls, the walls wept honey-colored fluid that smelled like childhood fear, and I saw paintings hung crookedly on the walls, each depicting a different door I'd opened. But the faces of those who entered them were scratched out. And then we came to a hallway, where 100 doors lined each side. And each door bore a name I recognized, some from my life, others from dreams, and still more that I didn't recognize. Until I looked longer and realized they were names I would one day brand. The other me guided me to one door labeled Final Self, and said, "This is who you'll become if you survive." And I asked what was behind the others, and he said, "All your failures," and the hallway shook then, violently, as a sound like breathing turned into a growl, and the doors began to open one by one, not inward but outward, releasing things that were not quite me but close enough to make my stomach twist, versions of myself warped by guilt, by hunger, by rage, by forgetting, and they crawled, limped, slithered toward me, whispering things I tried not to understand. And I ran through the hallway, past doors labeled regret and denial and escape, and finally burst through a doorway marked only with my initials, and found myself in my own bedroom. Or something pretending to be, only the bed was wrong. It was too large, too organic, its blankets pulsing as if they had veins beneath them, and the ceiling swirled with eyes that blinked at the rhythm of my heartbeat. And then I heard it, the knocking, 5 times. But not on my door, on the inside of my wall, and when I pressed my ear to it, I heard myself sobbing, begging to be let out, and then laughing, and then the wall split open like a wound, revealing another hallway, narrower this time, carved from teeth, and I walked it without question, each step echoing with the sound of my own breath, taken at the same time, in some other version of the house. And it led to a cathedral of roots and bone, where pews made of ribs faced an altar draped in skin. And above it floated a book bound in my own handwriting, its pages turning themselves, revealing a language I suddenly remembered how to read. And the words said, "You built this place from every choice you failed to make," and the book closed, turned to ash. And from that ash rose a figure cloaked in shadow, with my mother's voice and my brother's hands. And it said, "You've nearly reached the 13th room," and offered me a chalice filled with a thick red fluid that hummed like electricity. And when I drank it, I saw everything, not just the house, but every possible version of it. Across infinite timelines, all stacked like lungs gasping in sync, each version of me opening doors I hadn't yet reached. Some screaming, some laughing, some turning into the walls themselves. And I understood then that the house was not just a live-it, was me, grown outward from my own mind, colonizing reality one dream at a time, and the rooms were thoughts I'd tried to forget, taking shape to trap me in the cycle of becoming. And just before I passed out, I saw the final door begin to glow with something older than light. And the whisper returned, now louder. 2 more nights, and you will know your shape. And I collapsed into the floor, which accepted me like a mother welcoming back her prodigal son. And I knew when I woke, I'd be closer to the truth that I'd ever been, and further from escape, than I could ever claw back from. My house grows a new room every night, part 13. My house grows a new room every night, and on the 28th night it gave me a room that was no longer bound by space or gravity, a shifting breathing cube suspended in the black marrow. Between what was real, and what had long since abandoned such definitions. And the doorway that led me in vanished the moment I stepped through it, sealing itself. In and out of the walls, constellations rearranging themselves into phrases written in bone light. And the floor beneath me rippled like liquid glass, forming steps where none had been seconds before, guiding me forward toward a throne that seemed to form and unform in pulses, always just slightly different each time I blinked, sometimes made of mirrors, sometimes of keys, sometimes of stitched together hands, reaching toward a crown that hovered but never landed, and seated upon it was a woman wearing my face, except her eyes were bottomless pits of ink, and her lips moved in reverse, forming words I could only understand by remembering them backward, and as I listened I felt something sharp unwind behind my eyes. A pressure like claws slipping free of skin. And then I remembered something I had never truly known. The house did not grow by accident, grew in reaction. Each room a bloom of emotional decay, each hallway a tumor of regret, and the woman with my face reached forward and touched my chest, and I watched my ribs open like a box, revealing a spinning crystalline structure of rooms I hadn't entered yet, pulsing like a miniature brain, and I could feel each one calling, each one begging to be made real, and when I stepped back, I realized the walls were mirrors, thousands of them, none showing my reflection, all showing a different room I had never seen but instantly recognized. And I moved from mirror to mirror, touching the glass as scenes played. Me inside a church made of drowned voices. Me speaking to a version of my mother with no mouth. Me being devoured by the house itself, only to emerge again as its architect. And one mirror didn't show anything at all. Just pulsed with a color I had no name for, and as I touched it, it cracked and spilled black smoke that coiled into a figure, tall and emaciated, with joints that bent wrong and a grin so wide it seemed stitched from horizon to horizon, and it whispered, "You've almost shed enough of yourself to fit." And I asked, "Fit what?" But it only laughed, and the room folded in on itself, collapsing like paper burning inward. And I landed in a chamber lined with red velvet walls that bled when touched, and the floor beneath me was a mosaic made from shattered teeth, and above me, chandeliers of preserved eyes swung gently, though there was no wind, each eye twitching in unison, following my every breath. And in the center of the room was a spiral staircase descending into a pit of infinite black, and I knew I had to go down, though every part of me screamed upward. And the deeper I descended, the more I forgot first my name, then my voice, then the concept of time itself, and, when I reached the bottom, I found a library made of lungs, every book pulsing as if breathing, and I pulled one down, opening it to find it already bleeding, the words alive and squirming into my fingertips. And as they entered me, I saw the origin of the house, how it wasn't built or found but chosen. Chosen by a dream long forgotten by the world, something ancient and buried under the first silence ever spoken, and it had found me because I was hollow in just the right shape, a vessel that could be remade into an architect, and the books began to chant, their pages flapping without wind, forming a chorus of warnings and blueprints and names I had not yet earned. And suddenly, the walls began to beat like a heart, and the library sank beneath a wave of static, and I surfaced in a memory I had buried, The first time I ever lied. A childhood moment so simple, yet so pivotal that I saw. Then, the branching moment where I first opened a door inside myself. And the house had started growing then. Not now, not recently, but long before I ever knew it existed. And it had waited, fed on every forgotten dream and accidental cruelty, building itself in silence until the moment I first turned the doorknob in what I believed was the real world. And the realization broke something inside me so completely that my shadow began screaming, separating from me like a living entity, crawling into the cracks of the floor to escape, and I followed, not by choice, but because the house demanded it, and I emerged in a nursery filled with cribs, each one holding a version of me. Some asleep, some screaming, some staring blankly with milky eyes, and overhead a mobile of severed tongues spun slowly, each one whispering a lullaby in a language I'd only heard in nightmares. And I picked up one of the infants and it opened its mouth to reveal a staircase descending deeper. And I climbed into it, down through the mouth of my past self, into a corridor lined with doors labeled with questions. Who did you leave behind? What did you pretend not to see? Why did you open the first door? And I answered each one in silence, and the silence opened more rooms, and eventually I came to a final hallway, narrower than any before, so tight it scraped the skin from my shoulders as I walked, and it ended in a single obsidian door carved with the number 13, and as I touched it, I felt every room I'd entered pulse within me, awakening, aligning, preparing. And I knew that whatever lay beyond this door would be the threshold, the point beyond which I would not return as anything I had ever been. And yet I pressed forward, the door opening, not with a creak, but with a breath, and I stepped into a room shaped like a question mark, filled with clocks that ticked backward, and at its center was a coffin filled with water, and inside floated me, eyes open, mouth smiling, whispering to no one, just 2 more nights. My house grows a new room every night, part 14. My house grows a new room every night, and on the 29th night it gave me a room that was utterly quiet. A silence so complete it roared in my ears like pressure deep under the ocean. And when I stepped into it, the air thickened immediately, clinging to my skin like oil, and the floor was black glass that reflected nothing, no ceiling, no walls, no me, and I realized then that I had entered the memory of a room that had never been built, a conceptual space formed not from architecture but from omission. And as I took a step forward, the surface cracked in a perfect circle around my foot but didn't shatter, only pulsed with a soft blue light. And the light spread, branching outward like veins, until the entire floor glowed beneath me in a map that resembled a brain scan overlaid with constellations I didn't recognize, but instinctively understood. And then the walls began to grow upward from the floor, like ink bleeding through paper, curling and twisting into impossible patterns that looped in and out of dimensions I couldn't track with sight alone. And the room became a shifting cathedral, its ceiling rising into a sky made of storm clouds frozen mid-collapse, and hanging in the center of it all was a chandelier made from cages, each holding a version of me, but not just the versions I feared or the ones I'd suppressed. There were ones I didn't recognize at all, a version of me made entirely of light and birdsong, one made of rust and bone, one with no eyes but 1,000 mouths, all singing in harmony, and another with skin like broken glass, whispering over and over, "You're almost complete." And the cages swung gently in a wind that didn't touch me, a movement timed to the slow, hollow beat of a massive heart embedded in the far wall, pumping black sap through golden veins that ran down the room's structure like circuitry. And suddenly, the sound returned not with a whisper or a voice, but with the echo of my own laughter from a time I hadn't reached yet, and it echoed forward through my teeth and into my mind, creating a second rhythm to match the heartbeat. My future self laughing at something I hadn't done. And I looked up to see a spiral staircase descending from nowhere, its steps made of numbers counting backward from infinity. And each step I took down made a part of me forget something I thought was fundamental. My favorite color, the shape of my father's hands, the feel of sunlight on skin, and yet I welcomed it, because the weight of memory had begun to rust the joints in my dreams, and I was eager to be fluid again, to move without the drag of remembering. And when I reached the bottom, I was in a replica of my old childhood bedroom, only wrong in every way. The posters on the wall displayed creatures I'd only seen in the deeper parts of the house. The bed pulsed as if breathing, and the closet whispered in a language made of sobbing and static. And on the dresser was a snow globe showing the entire house I'd traveled. Every room nested inside the next, like a fractal blooming inward. And as I watched, a new room bloomed from the top, and inside it was me, watching the snow globe. And I dropped it, but it didn't fall, it rose upward, cracking open mid-air, like an egg. And from inside fell a key, warm and humming, shaped like a question mark with no dot, and the moment I touched it, I was no longer in the bedroom, I was standing on the roof of the house. Though the house now stretched beyond the curvature of the earth, into the stars, into clouds of impossible color and shapes that flinched when looked at, and the stars above whispered secrets in binary and grief. And I knew that this was the second to last room, the penultimate threshold, where everything I'd avoided had been kept on ice, waiting for the moment I'd be desperate enough to ask for truth. And as I turned to look behind me, I saw all the doors I'd opened, forming a massive spine stretching out across the cosmos. Each vertebra a room I'd survived, and at the very end of that spine was a door that was breathing, growing teeth, waiting for me. And I descended once more, down a ladder of laughter, into a room made of letters I never sent, filled with people I never forgave, and they stood in rows, mannequins of memory wearing the faces of my guilt, and as I walked among them, they wept not from their eyes. Boo!